Okay, good morning again, everybody. I had looked at the Daily Word this morning, and I was just um, thrilled. It was like I picked it out especially for the passage of scripture I'm going to use. So it's definitely about divine guidance. So I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to read a few verses of scripture from the book of Genesis because it's a really powerful little section that I think is often overlooked, and it's about Abraham. And I'm going to help remind you, in case you've gotten confused, who Abraham was. And the timeline is quite remarkable, and I'll explain that to you in a minute. God said to, by the way, in in the beginning of the when we hear about Abraham and his wife Sarah, they're not named Abraham and Sarah. Their names were changed later. They were Abram and Sarai. But I'm just going to go ahead with the names we know because it's less confusing. The Lord said to Abraham, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." So Abraham left as the Lord told him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired. Sorry to say, but what that means is they're slaves, lots of them. And they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abraham traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. The Canaanites were in the land. But the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So Abraham built an altar there to the Lord. From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent. There he built another altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. This is the word of the Lord. Set the stage. Abraham lived 500 or 600 years before Moses. Now, what we remember about Moses, right? God spoke to Moses in a burning bush, and this voice that Moses didn't know, this divine being of whom he he had heard, but he really didn't know anything about this divine being because they had their own gods for their own cultures, and they moved them around with them. And Moses said, "Who are you?" I mean, most of us would have just passed out from fear, but according to the scriptures, Moses had enough sense. First of all, the voice said, "Take off your shoes because you are standing on holy ground." And there was this green bush that was aflame. So we would have been calling 911, right? And Moses said, "Who are you?" And the voice said, "I am that I am." And after that, you know what happened. Moses eventually helped take the 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 folks that were enslaved in Egypt and helped them get away from the Pharaoh who was not very good, to put it mildly. Helped them get away, and then you remember they went to Mount Sinai, and Moses felt called to go to the top of this very high mountain, and he was there for a long time, and he received the 10 Commandments. Okay, now what's really, and I'll come back to that, but what's important to realize is this happened 600 years after Abraham. 600 years later. We obviously don't have any history of our country that far back. And those of us that have traveled in other parts of the world have seen buildings that were built 1,000 years ago, we've seen in Egypt, we've seen pyramids that were built about the time of Abraham, 4 or 5 thousand years ago. So just to get a sense of all of this, and I'll come back. I'm going to tell you about Abraham because it's really remarkable. And honestly, I hadn't quite thought about it this way in all my years of studying the Bible and taking classes and reading. And I hadn't quite thought this way before. What I'm going to tell you about Abraham. Abraham lived about 600 years before Moses. Moses lived about 2,000 years before Christ was born. You got that? So 2,600 years ago or so, Abraham was born. And then about 2,200 years ago, right? When Christ was born, here we are. So you see, there's this massive span of time. And most of us, I mean, thinking back 50 years is hard for a lot of us. Now, here's the thing about Abraham. Abraham would not have had any external knowledge of the Creator God. Nobody had ever heard of the Creator God. And it was hundreds of years later before Moses started helping people understand about the Creator God. Abraham heard a voice he didn't know. The voice said to him, "Take your family, your animals, your possessions, and go get ready to move to a land that I will show you, but you don't know where you're going and you don't know how long it's going to take." And he did. Can you imagine that conversation between him and Sarah? "Hey, Sarah, guess what? We're packing up. I know we've been here for generations, but we're packing up. Where are we going? I don't know. How will we know when we get there? I don't know. How long will it take? I don't know. How are we going to take care of ourselves and our animals and food and water and supplies? I don't know, but we're going." And amazingly, they apparently stayed together. I don't know how. But get this, Abraham had no prior knowledge, at least as far as the scholars can figure it out. He had absolutely no prior knowledge of a divine God who encompassed everyone and everything. Nobody had ever thought of that before, apparently. One of the scholars I read said Abraham basically invented Judaism because it didn't exist. The gods, whatever they worshipped, as you know, were objects or trees or bushes or whatever, and it was all localized. So when they moved, they had to either take those objects with them or find some new objects, but they didn't have any sense of a universal creator. And you probably know that Abraham is considered the father of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And all three monotheistic traditions hold Abraham and Sarah in the highest respect and regard. and acknowledge that we probably wouldn't even have most of what we believe about divinity without that. Now, we as Unity and many, many other people believe, from many, many spiritual traditions, believe that all of us are holy, even if we forget it, even when we forget it, that all beings are created by the divine, all beings have divinity in them, even when it doesn't seem obvious. And Abraham somehow knew that, and he believed that about this voice that said, pack up everything you own, everything you've ever known, and go. Now, for him and Sarah and all of the other folks and animals and properties that they carried with them, this was a physical journey. But for us, it's, and sometimes it is for us, a physical journey. But for us as believers, it's a spiritual journey. And haven't all of us, I certainly have, haven't all of us had divine intuition, something that tells us we need spiritually, metaphysically, to go to a place we don't know, to leave behind some of the beliefs, fears, whatever, that have been keeping us locked into a particular spiritual space that's not healthy. And we've been stuck there sometimes, for decades sometimes. And we've been afraid to move away from that spiritual place. And perhaps we've heard messages, we've received messages, maybe some of us have received messages for years. It's time for you to leave that behind and trust your own divine being, that you need to go to a new place, a new belief system, a new understanding of your own divinity, a new understanding of how all that's divine is supporting you and loving you and forgiving you. Well, that's a journey worth taking. And as we know, sometimes we have great resistance to taking that journey because we've gotten stuck. And I certainly can speak to that from personal experience, gotten stuck in particular beliefs or fears or anxieties, or just feeling comfortable with where it was. Yeah, I am, not just physically but spiritually, and to learn to expand my horizons, my soul. So Abraham trusted, we're going to just say God. And we understand that when I talk about God, I'm not talking about out there, I'm not talking about something removed. I'm talking about my spiritual journey, your spiritual journey, the divinity within all of us. And when we've had the courage and the vision to move out of whatever that was, wherever that was, it felt so permanent that we were just stuck there, whatever that was, however that was. If we have the courage and the faith to step away into a new space spiritually. Our lives change. And here's what I understand now about Abraham that I really hadn't understood, besides the fact that just the remarkable fact of his willingness to move beyond anything that he had ever heard spiritually. Abraham didn't just believe in Yahweh. Abraham believed Yahweh. Abraham had a relationship with the divine, which is what all of us are longing for and stretching for. And I believe that all of us have that. But it was so remarkable that Abraham was able to create that in his own life and soul and convince his family of this. Now, they didn't know either. So this is what happened that I really want to just zero in on briefly, and that I'd never thought about before. Which every time I prepare for a spiritual message, I learn something I didn't know, and I think of something I didn't think before. And the little bit of the scripture that I read to you this morning from Genesis 12, and apparently it was over the span of quite a bit of time. Remember, they were nomads, so they had animals that needed pasture and fresh water. So they lived in tents. That this would have been no small task to pick up all of this stuff and put it on some sort of vehicle that they could transport it. All of these animals that had to be herded and fed and find water and find fresh pasture. So they're constantly having to move to take care of their animals, which were their life. Without the animals, they would have died. Abraham built at least 2 altars to Yahweh. Now, the fact that somebody in Canaan at that point built an altar was nothing unusual, and apparently the archaeologists have uncovered many, many altars um, to various deities. Abraham built 2. Now, when I first read that, I'm thinking, okay, sometimes in their flower gardens, especially if people, I don't know what these are called, some of you know, but where you take some rocks that look really nice and you make a little pile of rocks. And I don't know what that's called, but you know what I'm talking about. I thought, okay, so we made a little pile of rocks. That's what I thought. And I thought, and then I started doing my work. No, these altars would have been a massive amount of work and would have probably required months at least to build, because first of all, he or whoever was with him probably cut massive pieces of stone, solid stone, out of the mountainside. Because that's what, when you look at pictures that they found, photographs that the archaeologists have found of ancient altars, that's what they look like. Most of them, they're huge monolithic, like pillars out of stone. Think about what they had to, first of all, to cut it, to shape it, to move it, to make it stand up. I mean, it's remarkable. And he built 2 of those that we know of as a reminder to the people that were passing by later, or that were in that vicinity wherever they were living, to remind them of this God that Abraham knew was more and greater than any object or any particular geographic space. So we built these altars to remind people of Yahweh. And this is what I want to say to you today. I believe that each one of us are called to be living altars, to remind people of our holiness and theirs. I want to close with another prayer. This is meditations on the Aramaic words of Jesus. So this is a translation. Oh, this is a not exactly a translation. This is an interpretation of part of the words from the Lord's Prayer. Hallowed be thy name. So it's a prayer, it's a meditation. You can just listen, you can close your eyes, whatever. Focus your light within us, make it useful as the rays of a beacon show the way. Help us breathe one holy breath, feeling only you. This creates a shrine inside in wholeness. Help us let go, clear the space inside of busy forgetfulness, so the name, the holy name, comes to live. Your name, your sound can move us if we tune our hearts as instruments for its tone. Hear the one sound that created all others. In this way, the name is hallowed in silence. In peace, the name resides. A room of one's own, a holy of holies, open, giving light to all. We look elsewhere for this light. It draws us out of ourselves. But the holy name always lives within. Focus your light within us. Make it useful. And let it be so.